Chapter 1. A Curious Afternoon in Rosehill. The September sun slanted gently across the neat lawns of Rosehill, turning the last of the roses to amber and gold. It was a Saturday afternoon, mild and a little drowsy, the sort of day when the village seemed content merely to exist. At the edge of the green, the church clock chimed 3 in its mellow voice, scattering a flock of starlings from the yew tree. Miss Marple sat on the wooden bench outside the post office, her knitting bag beside her. She was not knitting, not at the moment, but watching as she so often did. It was an old habit, the quiet taking in of people and their small gestures. She had discovered long ago that if one sat still enough, the whole world wandered past and told its story. From the bakery came the smell of fresh loaves. From the public house, a faint note of hops. 2 children rolled a hoop along the gravel path, their shrieks bright against the calm air. Across the lane, Mrs. Penberry, the vicar's wife, leaned out of the parsonage window to shake crumbs from a cloth. There was nothing in any of it, nothing that should have troubled the afternoon. Yet there was, that day, a sense of something stirring. Perhaps it was the arrival of Mrs. Harriet Linton, recently widowed, who had taken up residence in the long-empty Harrington house at the far end of Church Lane. The property had been shuttered for nearly a decade. Ivy clung to its gables, and a pane of glass in the attic window caught the light strangely, as if winking at some private joke. Villagers, Miss Marple knew, had already begun to speculate about the widow's reasons for choosing such a lonely place. Mrs. Linton herself appeared presently, walking with an air that was both brisk and cautious. She wore a dove-gray suit and a hat trimmed with a single dark feather. Passing the bench, she offered Miss Marple a small, courteous smile, which the old lady returned with warmth. "Good afternoon," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "I trust you are settling in?" Mrs. Linton hesitated before replying. "As well as can be expected, thank you. Harrington House needs rather more attention than the agent mentioned." A pause, then. "It's an odd place, really. Full of corners." Miss Marple's eyes rested on her for a moment. "Old houses do have a way of collecting corners," she said. "And sometimes stories, too." The widow inclined her head but did not pursue the remark. She crossed the green and disappeared into the narrow lane, her heels tapping lightly against the cobbles. A little later, Constable Pritchard cycled past, giving Miss Marple a respectful nod. He looked flushed and uncomfortable, as though the uniform was too tight for him, or perhaps the news he carried sat awkwardly in his mind. She wondered about that. Pritchard had never been good at hiding his feelings. By tea-time, talk had begun to drift through the village, a disturbance up at Harrington House. Something about a locked room, the old widow's secret room, someone called it, and a shout heard by the gardener. Nobody seemed quite clear. But by evening, word was out that a man had been found inside, lying quite still on the floorboards. Miss Marple, pouring herself a modest cup of Earl Grey, allowed the whispers to settle in her thoughts. Rosehill was rarely the stage for drama. A still body in an old house could mean many things, but experience had taught her that coincidence was seldom the simplest explanation. She would, she decided, attend to her roses in the morning, and perhaps take a walk past Harrington House. One never knew when a pair of observant eyes might be needed. Chapter 2. The Rumor Gathers. Sunday morning in Rosehill had a rhythm all its own. By 9:30, the narrow lane leading to St. Mildred's was alive with quiet purpose. Parishioners in their best coats, children tugging at gloves, the faint clang of the church bell echoing across the meadows. Sunlight spilled through drifting clouds, making the grass wet with dew gleam like polished silver. Miss Marple, walking with her parasol, noted how the usual calm was tinged with a hum of expectancy. Small groups formed at corners, heads inclined together, voices low but animated. Even the vicar, greeting people at the lych gate, looked distracted, his smile a little too fixed. Inside, the air smelled faintly of candle wax and chrysanthemums. Miss Marple chose a pew near the back, where she could see without being seen. Mrs. Linton, the widow, arrived a moment later, slipping into a seat halfway up the aisle. She kept her veil lowered, though sunlight traced the outline of her cheek. Her hands, folded tightly around a prayer book, trembled almost imperceptibly. During the sermon, a well-meant discourse on neighborly charity. More than one head turned toward her. Miss Marple caught the sidelong glances and noted the curious mixture of pity and prurience in them. The story, whatever its details, was spreading. After the final hymn, people spilled out into the crisp morning, reluctant to go home before collecting every scrap of news. Mrs. Penberry was quick to supply the latest version. "They say it was a man," she whispered to Miss Marple, eyes round behind her spectacles. "Found in a little room off the upstairs corridor. Stone cold, poor soul. And Mrs. Linton in such a state, naturally." "Do they know who he was?" asked Miss Marple. Mrs. Penberry shook her head. "Not yet. Pritchard told the vicar only that the doctor had been called, and Inspector Graves is on his way from Market Bletchley. Some talk of a fall, others of, well," she leaned closer, "of violence." Miss Marple's brow furrowed, though she kept her voice serene. "How very distressing for Mrs. Linton." "Indeed. And she's only been here a fortnight. Imagine, a stranger, dead in one's own house. Gives one a turn, doesn't it?" The group dispersed slowly, each person setting off with an air of grave importance, as though carrying fragments of evidence in their pockets. Miss Marple, meanwhile, lingered near the lich-gate, considering. She had known Harriet Linton only by sight, but something about the widow's manner, the taut composure, the way her gaze slid from face to face without resting, hinted at a story not yet told. And then there was the house itself, Harrington House, standing aloof at the end of its lane like a figure holding its breath. At home, while trimming a cluster of late roses, Miss Marple reflected on the little she had learned. A man, dead in a locked chamber. A widow newly arrived. No clear explanation. She could almost hear the pattern of human nature beneath the bare facts. Pride, perhaps, or desperation, the quiet resentments that flower unseen. By afternoon, a police motor car was spotted climbing Church Lane, its tires spattering mud on the hedges. Constable Pritchard pedaled behind, perspiring under his helmet. Several villagers, pretending to sweep steps or prune borders, watched their progress with unabashed interest. Miss Marple took up her knitting by the sitting-room window, where she had an unimpeded view of Harrington House through a gap in the apple trees. Curtains in one upstairs room were drawn tight. In another, someone moved briefly before the fabric fell back into place. She threaded her needles calmly, though her thoughts were anything but idle. Experience had shown her that answers rarely arrive by storm. They crept, shy and half-formed, into the mind of one who waited patiently. She meant to wait and watch. Chapter 3. At the gate of Harrington House. By Monday morning, Rosehill had entirely abandoned the pretense of ordinary life. Milk deliveries took twice as long, for each doorstep offered an opportunity to exchange theories. The postman, who was normally brisk, stopped for cups of tea at every cottage and emerged with new scraps of information. Even the butcher, a man of few words, was heard to remark that "there's more behind this than meets the eye." Miss Marple, for her part, began the day in her usual way. Toast, a single boiled egg and the Times crossword, but her thoughts kept wandering up Church Lane. By 10:30 she decided that a walk would be good for her roses, which, after all, appreciated a gardener who kept herself in motion. The lane was quiet except for birdsong and the distant clatter of a cart on the main road. Harrington House came into view at the top of the rise, a somber Georgian pile set back from the verge, its shutters pale with neglect. Close up, the house revealed itself as both elegant and faintly forbidding. A tall hedge ran along the boundary, broken only by an iron gate that bore an ornamental H. Constable Pritchard was stationed there, notebook in hand. He looked relieved to see Miss Marple, as though the calm presence of an elderly lady might lend steadiness to a morning full of uncertainty. "Good day, Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. "I shouldn't really let anyone near, but, well, it's you. I assure you, my dear Pritchard, I've no intention of intruding." Her gaze passed beyond him to the house, where curtains stirred faintly at an upper window. "How is Mrs. Linton?" "Shaken, as you'd expect. Inspector Graves has been with her most of the morning. They're keeping her in the drawing-room for now." "And the poor man who was found?" Pritchard hesitated. "Name of Henry Durrant, far as we've learned. Traveler of some sort. Carried letters with several addresses. Doc says he'd been dead some hours before Mrs. Linton called us." Miss Marple knitted her brows. How curious that a traveler should choose such a hidden place. That's just it, Pritchard replied, lowering his voice. He wasn't meant to be in the house at all. Door to the room was locked on the inside. Took a good bit of persuasion to get it open. Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. She watched the wind catch at the ivy along the front wall, watched to the gardener, a thin, weather-beaten fellow, carry a bundle of tools round the side. The air smelt faintly of damp stone and old leaves. At length she asked, "Did Mrs. Linton know him?" Pritchard shuffled his boots. "Says she's never set eyes on him, ma'am. Inspector's not entirely sure. There's talk he might have been an acquaintance of her late husband. Or else someone come on business." "Or on mischief," Miss Marple murmured. A footstep sounded on the gravel drive. Inspector Graves appeared, solid in his tweed coat, face set in lines of practical patience. He nodded to Miss Marple without surprise. Rosehill's long-standing resident was, after all, a figure who seemed to appear wherever puzzles were to be found. "Morning, Miss Marple. I was hoping you'd wander this way," he said. "You've a knack for noticing the sort of detail the rest of us miss." "I merely keep my eyes open," she replied, her voice mild. He gestured towards the house. "We've a body in a locked chamber, a widow who swears she knows nothing, and a handful of papers that make less sense than a crossword in Sanskrit. If you've a mind to stroll round the garden, I'd be obliged if you told me later what you make of it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I shall do my best." As Graves returned inside, she followed the gravel path along the side of the house. Fallen leaves lay thick beneath a laurel hedge, and here and there weeds pushed through the flagstones. Her eye caught the faint outline of a narrow door half hidden by ivy. Not the grand entrance, but a modest servant's access. Its latch hung rusted, yet the ground showed signs of recent disturbance. Miss Marple stooped, brushing a few twigs aside. A scrap of fabric, gray tweed, clung to the edge of the stone step. She did not touch it, merely noted its presence and straightened slowly, her mind turning over possibilities. The breeze carried the faint chime of the church clock, and beyond the hedge the village seemed peaceful, unaware of how much darker its stories might grow. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, eyes narrowing with gentle curiosity. There were, she thought, already more questions than answers. Chapter 4. The Room Behind the Panel. Harrington House, from within, proved to be as dignified as it was on the outside, but also colder, as though the years it had stood empty had seeped into the walls. Miss Marple followed Inspector Graves through a hall lined with faded portraits. A clock ticked solemnly on a console table, its hands creeping towards noon. "The place has good bones," Graves remarked, his voice low out of respect for the hush of the house. "But there's something close about it, as if it doesn't want visitors." Miss Marple agreed silently. She noted how the staircase curved towards a shadowed landing, how dust motes wavered in a shaft of pale light, and how every step on the parquet floor echoed as though a little too loud. They stopped before a paneled corridor where Constable Pritchard stood guard. He stepped aside, revealing a narrow passage behind a section of wall that had been slid back on concealed runners. The air beyond was markedly cooler. "This," said Graves, "is the way to what Mrs. Linton called her secret room. She says she discovered it only last week, while exploring. Apparently it was once used for storage or other purposes. She'd meant to have it aired." Miss Marple looked around with interest. The entrance was cleverly hidden. From the corridor it appeared to be nothing more than an expanse of oak paneling. She followed the inspector down the short passage until they came to a stout door with a tarnished brass knob. Inside lay a small chamber with a low-beamed ceiling and a single mullioned window, its panes opaque with grime. A rug, old but serviceable, covered most of the floorboards. Against one wall stood a writing desk. Beside it, an armchair lay toppled on its side. And on the rug, in an attitude that suggested neither sleep nor peace, was the late Henry Durrant. Miss Marple observed the scene with quiet gravity. The man was middle-aged, dressed in an unremarkable suit now rumpled by death. One hand lay outstretched towards the hearth, where a scattering of gray ash suggested some paper had recently burned. Near his elbow rested a leather briefcase, its clasp undone. Graves gestured towards it. "Empty." Whatever he brought, it isn't here. Miss Marple bent, carefully, mindful not to disturb anything, and peered at the floor beneath the chair. A faint line marked the boards where the rug had been shifted, as if something heavy had been dragged or placed there and later removed. She also noticed a faint smell in the air. Not just dust, but something metallic, almost bitter. Dr. Milsom. Graves prompted. A stocky man in spectacles looked up from where he crouched beside the body. Time of death sometime late Friday evening, he said. Cause, not yet certain. No obvious wound, but see the lips? A tinge of blue. I'd wager some form of poisoning. Graves frowned. Poison, locked door, missing papers. Tidy business. Miss Marple's eyes traveled around the chamber again. There was no fire laid in the grate, though ashes suggested a paper had indeed been burnt. The window was latched on the inside, its sill thick with dust save for a faint smudge where fingers might have rested. And there, by the skirting board, a small silver button gleamed incongruously against the gloom. She pointed it out lightly. Someone has lost part of their wardrobe. Graves crouched to examine it. Not from the victim. His jacket buttons are intact. Good eye, Miss Marple. She merely smiled, but her mind was already knitting threads. The secret room, the ashes, the hidden latch, the widow who claimed surprise at the discovery. On the way out, she paused to study the corridor again, particularly the slide of the panel. Its edges showed no dust at all, as though moved more often than once in a decade. Outside, pale sunshine stretched across the drive. From somewhere at the back of the house came the rhythmic sound of a spade striking earth. Miss Marple, adjusting her gloves, felt the stirrings of a familiar certainty, that the story everyone thought they knew was only a shadow of what had truly happened. Chapter 5. The Widow Speaks. The drawing room of Harrington House, though comfortably furnished, held an air of unease that morning. Pale curtains let in a watery sun, which picked out the polished legs of a rosewood table and cast trembling reflections in the gilt of a mirror above the mantel. A small fire had been lit, but the warmth seemed unable to reach the corners. Mrs. Harriet Linton sat on a sofa near the hearth, gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. She wore a dark green day dress and a hat that cast a faint shadow over her face. Her posture was perfectly correct, yet there was an alertness about her, a watchful tension like a bird ready to take flight. Inspector Graves stood by the mantelpiece, notebook open. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, occupied a straight-backed chair a little to one side, her knitting needles resting across her knees. Mrs. Linton, Graves began, voice steady but kind, I'd like to go over your account once more, just for clarity. Of course, she said, her tone measured. I understand. You mentioned finding the passage on Friday? Yes. She drew a breath. I had decided to explore the upper floor properly. Harrington House has so many odd cupboards and recesses. I noticed a draft near the end of the corridor, and when I pressed at the paneling, a section gave way. Behind it was the little passage. And that room. You didn't enter straight away? I did. It was dusty but otherwise quite clean, as though someone had already swept it. Her voice trembled slightly on the last word. I remember thinking it might make a pleasant sewing room once aired. And Mr. Durrant? Graves prompted gently. I didn't see him then. The door was locked. She hesitated, smoothing the edge of her glove. On Saturday morning I went back, intending to measure the window for curtains. That was when I saw him on the floor. Miss Marple watched her carefully. The widow's words were precise, but her fingers betrayed her, working restlessly against the soft leather of her gloves. Had you ever met Mr. Durrant? Graves asked. Never. Her reply was immediate, almost too swift. I've thought, and I cannot imagine why he would be here. Graves nodded, jotting in his book. The latch on the door was turned from inside. Window fastened as well. There's a key missing from the bunch we found in the kitchen drawer. Would you know where it might be? I know. Her eyes darted towards the window before returning to the inspector. The solicitor gave me all the keys when I purchased the house. I've not misplaced any. A silence fell. In it, the faint tick of the clock on the mantel grew loud. Miss Marple spoke at last, her voice mild as warm milk. "You mentioned a draft, Mrs. Linton. Was it strong enough that someone might have noticed from the corridor?" Mrs. Linton considered. "Perhaps, yes, I suppose so." "And had anyone else been in the house recently?" "A maid, a workman." "Only Mr. Barker, the gardener," she replied. "He comes twice a week." Miss Marple inclined her head, as if filing the answer away with several others. Inspector Graves closed his notebook. "Thank you, Mrs. Linton. That's enough for now. We'll ask the doctor to complete his examination, and I may need another word later." When they had left the room, Miss Marple lingered for a moment. She looked about the quiet drawing room, at the polished brass fender, the carefully arranged flowers, the single photograph on the side table, a younger Harriet Linton with a tall, unsmiling man. Out in the corridor, Graves lowered his voice. "Well, Miss Marple, anything strike you?" She gave a faint, apologetic smile. "Only that grief sits oddly on some shoulders. Mrs. Linton is troubled, yes, but not quite in the way one expects of a woman who has just found a dead stranger in her home." Graves raised a brow. "Meaning?" "Meaning," Miss Marple said gently, "that she is guarding something. Whether it concerns Mr. Durrant or her own past, I cannot yet tell. But it is there, a little shadow behind her eyes." The inspector exhaled and tucked his pencil behind his ear. "We'll keep digging." Miss Marple nodded, retrieving her knitting as they prepared to leave. The house behind them seemed to retreat into its own silence, holding fast to the secret that had been born in its hidden room. Chapter 6. Talk over tea and trellis. By Tuesday morning, Rosehill had settled into a peculiar blend of excitement and unease. Curtains twitched before dawn, milkmen were interrogated as though they carried state secrets, and every threshold became a convenient perch for neighbors to exchange theories. The scent of early chrysanthemums floated through the lanes, deceptively innocent. Miss Marple, having watered her geraniums, made her way to the post office for stamps. Inside, a small knot of customers had gathered, apparently absorbed in the display of penny cards. Their conversation, however, had nothing to do with postcards. "I'm telling you," declared Mrs. Penberry, her spectacles sliding down her nose, "it's a robbery gone wrong. These travelers prey on lonely widows." "Oh no," countered Mr. Binns the grocer, shaking his head. "That fellow looked respectable enough. A clerk or such. Likely business with her late husband." "Business that ends in poison?" asked young Kitty, who helped at the bakery. She lowered her voice, but not enough to prevent the entire room from hearing. "My cousin says the doctor thinks he was done in with something slipped into his drink." "Drink?" Mrs. Penberry gasped. "But there wasn't any glass in the papers." Miss Marple selected her stamps and regarded the group with mild interest. "I wonder," she said gently, "if it might be best not to hurry the story along faster than the truth allows. Inspector Graves is quite thorough." Mr. Binns grunted agreement, but Kitty looked disappointed at this dampening of drama. Outside, the village green basked under a weak sun. Children played hopscotch near the lich gate. A farmer's cart clattered by, its wheels scattering leaves. Miss Marple paused to watch, her mind traveling not with the gossip but with the little pieces of fact she had gathered. The missing key, the ashes in the grate, the button by the skirting board, and Mrs. Linton's measured account. She crossed to the tea shop where Mrs. Cooper, the proprietress, was setting out tables beneath a trellis heavy with late roses. The warm scent of scones drifted through the open door. "Morning, Miss Marple," Mrs. Cooper said brightly. "You'll be wanting your usual pot? Please, and one of those currant scones, if I may." Miss Marple settled at a table that gave a view both of the High Street and the distant lane leading to Harrington House. Several villagers soon drifted over, drawn as much by curiosity as by the promise of tea. They spoke of little else but the dead man in the secret room. Some speculated he had been blackmailing Mrs. Linton. Others suggested an old smuggling tale attached to the house. A retired schoolmistress insisted on the possibility of hidden treasure. Each theory grew more elaborate than the last. Miss Marple listened, stirring her tea with slow precision. Now and then she put in a mild remark, not to correct but to encourage a fact to emerge from beneath the embroidery. It was from the blacksmith's wife, Mrs. Hargreaves, that she gleaned a useful scrap, She had seen a figure leaving Harrington House on Friday evening. A man walking briskly down the lane just as dusk fell. He had carried something long and thin wrapped in brown paper. "Did you recognize him?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. Mrs. Hargreaves shook her head. "Too far," and eyed the dog tugging on his lead. "But I thought it odd. No one ever goes that way after dark." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully and sipped her tea. Behind her calm expression, the small, quiet machinery of her mind began to turn a little faster. Across the square, the bell above the inn door rang as a visitor stepped inside. A tall man in a worn tweed coat, unfamiliar to most of Rosehill, paused to glance at the tea shop before moving on towards the telephone kiosk. Miss Marple's eyes followed him for an instant, then returned to her companions. There was, she felt, a pattern forming, faint yet insistent, like the first stitches of a complex piece of lace. And somewhere at its heart was the truth about a widow, a traveler, and a room that had kept its silence too long. Chapter 7. The Gardener's Spade. Inspector Graves preferred to get his hands on a witness early in the day, before their story became embroidered by memory or the comments of neighbors. By mid-morning Wednesday he was striding across the side lawn of Harrington House, boots leaving crisp impressions on the grass still silvered with dew. Miss Marple followed at a polite distance, leaning on her parasol and admiring, or appearing to admire, the untidy shrubbery. She had been invited along on the thinnest of pretexts. An extra pair of ears, Graves had said, but she knew he valued her knack for hearing what was not said. Barker, the gardener, was kneeling near the rose beds with a small fork in his hand. A wiry man in his late 50s. He wore corduroy trousers shiny with use and a jacket patched at the elbows. He rose stiffly when Graves hailed him. "Morning, sir." "Miss," he added, tugging at the brim of his cap. "Morning, Barker." Graves consulted his notebook. "You've been working here since Mrs. Linton moved in?" "That's right. Started the week she arrived. Place was half a jungle." "You were here on Friday evening?" Barker shifted, eyes dropping to the lawn. "Yes, sir. Just finishing off. Mrs. Linton asked me to tidy the path by the orchard. Did you see or hear anything unusual?" Graves pressed. The man hesitated, scratching behind one ear. "Not much. I'd packed up by 6:30. There was someone. Thought I heard boots on the gravel out front as I was wheeling the barrow round. Didn't see who, though." Miss Marple's voice floated gently across the lawn. "Would that have been near the time you normally leave?" "Aye, near enough, ma'am. Bit later than usual. I'd stayed to clear brambles by the hedge." He glanced at her, then at the inspector as if gauging how much to say. "I did notice one thing." "Probably nothing." Graves looked up from his notes. "Out with it." Barker pointed with his fork towards a narrow strip of soil near the side door. "That patch there was turned over, as if something had been buried and taken up again. I meant to mention it, but, well, what with the police here, I thought best to keep quiet." Together they walked to the spot. The earth showed faint disturbances, a soft hollow, then a ridge where someone had pressed the soil flat. Miss Marple bent carefully, brushing a few withered leaves aside. Her fingers encountered a shard of waxed paper, the edge singed. "Curious," she murmured, passing it to the inspector. Graves held it to the light. "Looks like the corner of an envelope. Burn marks, see? Same as in the grate upstairs." Barker shuffled. "There was more rubbish in the brazier behind the potting shed, sir. Thought Mrs. Linton had cleared old papers." "We'll take a look," said Graves, slipping the fragment into an envelope. "Anything else?" The gardener frowned, searching memory. "Only Mrs. Linton herself, Friday afternoon. She came out by the orchard and asked how late I meant to work. Seemed a bit unsettled, like she had visitors she wasn't sure about." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the inspector, hers mild, his sharp. "Thank you, Barker," Graves said. "You've been helpful." As they returned to the drive, Miss Marple considered the new threads. Burnt paper, a dug patch of earth, a widow nervously timing her gardener's departure. Each might be innocent, but together they whispered of a story whose shape was becoming clearer. She paused by the old sundial, letting the breeze play with the ribbon on her hat. "You know," she said softly, Gardens have a way of keeping secrets, but they're also rather good at giving them up, if one listens with patience. Graves gave a dry smile. And I suppose you'll be listening. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint nod. Always. Chapter 8. Ashes and Other Shadows. The potting shed at Harrington House stood a little apart from the main garden, half hidden behind a tangle of elder and bramble. Its door sagged on rusty hinges, and an old climbing rose sprawled across the roof as though clinging for dear life. The morning sun reached only as far as the threshold, leaving the interior steeped in a cool dimness. Inspector Graves stepped inside first, stooping beneath the low lintel. "Mind your footing," he called back. "Floor's uneven." Miss Marple followed carefully, her parasol serving as a discreet walking stick. The air smelt of damp earth, linseed oil, and faint smoke. In one corner stood a brazier, its metal sides blackened with soot. A heap of gray ash filled its belly. Graves crouched, poking gently with the end of a trowel. "Still warm," he observed. "Who's been burning things this morning?" Barker, hovering in the doorway, shifted uneasily. "I keep it for garden waste, sir, prunings, dead twigs. I lit it last week, not since." Miss Marple peered over the inspector's shoulder. Among the ash gleamed fragments of paper not quite consumed, jagged pieces bearing half-letters, a faint smear of sealing wax, the edge of a cream envelope. Graves fished out several with tweezers, laying them on a wooden bench. "Looks like correspondence," he muttered. "Someone meant to make sure we couldn't read it." He turned over another scrap, frowning at a few legible words. "Shall arrive. Friday dusk. Keep hidden." The rest was charred beyond rescue. "Interesting," Miss Marple said softly. She moved a little closer to the doorway, letting her gaze travel across the patch of lawn beyond the shed. There, the soil barker had mentioned lay in a rough oval, shaded by the old quince tree. A spade leaned against the wall, its blade clean. Too clean, perhaps, for a tool supposedly used on garden refuse. Graves followed her glance. "Barker, did you dig over that bit yesterday?" The gardener shook his head. "No, sir. Not me." Graves knelt, examining the ground. He lifted a small clod with his penknife, sniffed, and rubbed it between his fingers. "Damp, but packed down recent. Whatever was here, it's gone." Miss Marple's eyes wandered to a nearby wheelbarrow, where something pale protruded from beneath a bundle of weeds. She lifted the corner delicately with the tip of her parasol. A glove, fine kid leather, dove gray, lay half hidden. It was a lady's glove, the right-hand one, faintly scented with violet. Graves carefully picked it up. Not the gardener's, at any rate. Miss Marple's expression was as placid as ever, but she filed the discovery away beside the silver button and the burnt envelope. Patterns, always patterns. Back in the kitchen, Graves spread the salvaged fragments across the table to dry. Miss Marple, seated with folded hands, watched in silence as he pieced together what he could. Words surfaced like shy fish. Delivery. Urgent. Enclosed list. Discretion. "Business papers," Graves said at last. Something Durrant carried. If they were harmless, why destroy them? "Because," Miss Marple replied gently, "sometimes the most dangerous thing is not the crime itself, but the reason it needed hiding." Outside, the wind stirred the trees, setting leaves whispering against the stone walls. The old house stood quiet under the September sun, but its shadows seemed to deepen, as though it knew more than it cared to tell. Chapter 9. The Stranger in Tweed. Late Wednesday afternoon found Rosehill bathed in an amber light that softened even the sharp angles of the village roofs. A faint breeze teased the last roses along the green, sending their petals scudding across the cobbles. Shopkeepers were just beginning to draw curtains against the setting sun when a figure appeared at the far end of the lane. Miss Marple, who had paused by the lich gate ostensibly to admire the evening sky, noticed him at once. He was tall, lean, and dressed in a tweed coat that had seen better days. A narrow case swung from his hand. He paused near the inn, scanning the signboard with a practiced air, then stepped inside. Within moments, the hum of conversation behind the windows quickened. The dog and duck had rarely been so lively on a weekday. Miss Marple, with a small inward smile, crossed the green and pushed open the door. The public bar smelled of oak polish and fresh bread. Mr. Pottle, the landlord, looked up from polishing glasses. "Evening, Miss Marple," he said, mildly surprised but clearly pleased. "Care for a half?" "Just a small lemonade, if I may," she replied, easing herself onto a stool near the hearth. From this vantage she could observe without intruding. The stranger had taken a table near the window, setting his case at his feet. He ordered ale and a plate of cold ham, then unfolded a newspaper, though his eyes flicked towards the counter more often than they followed the print. Miss Marple noted the strong lines of his face, the quickness of his glance, and the faint smudge of soil on his cuff. Before long, Kitty from the bakery slipped in, eager to glean the latest. She whispered to Pottle, who gave a discreet nod towards the newcomer. "Name of Rowan," he murmured to her, just loud enough that Miss Marple caught it. "Booked a room for the week." Mr. Rowan, for his part, seemed perfectly at ease, yet his manner bore a subtle tautness, like a man traveling with purpose rather than for pleasure. He finished his meal, rose, and addressed Pottle in a voice clear enough for the room. "Might I use the telephone? Need to place a call before supper." The landlord led him to the instrument behind the counter. Miss Marple, busy with her lemonade, listened to the faint click of the receiver and a low murmur of words she could not quite catch. When Rowan returned, he paid for his meal with precise coins and withdrew upstairs. The moment the door closed behind him, chatter erupted. "Do you suppose he's police?" Kitty speculated. "Or a lawyer?" "Could be a journalist," offered Mr. Pottle, drying a tankard. "They're sniffing round Market Bletchley already." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind had seized on the soil on Rowan's cuff, the narrow case, and the timing of his arrival. She rose presently, thanked Mr. Pottle, and stepped outside. Twilight lay soft upon the village. In the distance, the windows of Harrington House caught the last of the sun, glowing faintly like embers. Miss Marple stood for a moment beneath the sign of the Dog and Duck, thoughtful and still. She had no wish to leap to conclusions. Years of experience had taught her the danger of that, but she felt, with a small certainty, that the man in tweed was no mere passing guest. There was, she sensed, a link running from that quiet bar to the secret room where Henry Durrant had met his end. The line was invisible for now, but steady, waiting to be traced. Chapter 10. A Conversation by the Hearth. The drawing-room at Harrington House glowed with the mellow light of a September evening. Heavy curtains framed the windows, keeping the first hint of autumn chill at bay. A log fire burned gently in the grate, throwing flickers of gold across the worn carpets and polished mahogany. Mrs. Linton sat upright on the sofa, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had dressed for company, though the pale lavender gown only emphasized the shadows under her eyes. On the low table lay the fragments Inspector Graves had salvaged from the brazier, now carefully arranged on a tray. Graves stood with his back to the fire, hands clasped behind him. "Mrs. Linton," he said in his quiet, deliberate way, "I should like to know when you last saw these papers." Her gaze lingered on the scorched scraps, but she did not reach for them. "I cannot say that I recognize them, Inspector." Miss Marple, settled in an armchair near the window, observed the exchange with mild interest. She noted the slight tension in Mrs. Linton's posture, the way her fingers twitched once, then stilled. "You kept Mr. Durrant's accounts?" Graves continued. "I kept the household books," she replied. "As for Mr. Durrant's private business, I did not intrude." Graves nodded, unconvinced. He lifted one charred slip. "This speaks of a delivery, Friday at dusk, and of something to be kept hidden." He paused. "Did Mr. Durrant receive callers that evening?" Mrs. Linton hesitated. "Not that I observed," she said finally, "though I may have been upstairs. He often conducted interviews alone." A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Miss Marple glanced at the hearthrug, then at the faint line of ash near the fender. Someone had brushed it hurriedly, but the marks were still there, a trail leading from the grate to the side table where the papers rested. Graves caught her look and bent to examine the spot. "Someone burnt these in a hurry," he remarked. "Why here when there's a brazier outside?" Mrs. Linton's lips pressed together. Perhaps Mr. Durrant wished for privacy. Or, Miss Marple said softly, perhaps someone wished the evidence gone before it could leave this room. Graves shot her a glance of appreciation. Indeed. He straightened, turning once more to the housekeeper. Where were you on Friday evening, Mrs. Linton? In the still room preparing a syrup, she replied without hesitation. Afterward, I went to my room to write letters. I did not come down until morning. Her tone was calm, but her knuckles whitened slightly on the sofa's arm. Miss Marple, noticing, wondered whether the syrup had truly taken the whole of Mrs. Linton's evening. Graves replaced the fragments on the tray. Very well, he said. We shall need to verify movements for everyone in the house. Mrs. Linton inclined her head, the picture of composure. Yet when she rose to ring for tea, her step faltered almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes thoughtful on the flames. A puzzle piece had clicked into place. The hidden papers, the brazier, the nervous housekeeper. But the picture they formed was not yet clear. Outside, dusk crept across the lawns, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, sharp and brief. The house seemed to settle around them, drawing its secrets closer. Chapter 11. Whispers on the Green. Morning sunlight lay clear and bright over Rosehill, washing the cottages in a pale gold that made their thatched roofs look almost new. A light breeze rustled the ivy on the churchyard wall as Miss Marple set out along the lane with an air of placid purpose. Her small shopping basket hung from her arm, but she had no pressing errands. She paused first at the grocer's, exchanging a cheerful word with Mrs. Cleeve about the late raspberries. From there she crossed the green, nodding to old Mr. Rudge, who was busy sweeping leaves from the path to the lychgate. Nothing in her manner suggested she was on an errand more serious than buying tea, yet her eyes missed very little. At the post office she lingered over the picture postcards, noting how Mrs. Blackwell lowered her voice when two farmhands came in. They were speaking of that man at the inn. One said Rowan had been asking after a delivery of trunks from London. The other laughed uneasily and remarked that it wasn't wise to poke about Harrington House. Miss Marple bought a fresh sheet of stamps, thanked the postmistress and went on. Her next stop was the vicarage, where Reverend Archer was clipping roses along the drive. He greeted her warmly and led her into a sitting room that smelled of tea and beeswax. I'm glad you called, Miss Marple, he said, pouring tea into china cups. There's such unrest in the village. Everyone's speculating. Some say smugglers, others an inheritance dispute. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. It is quite natural, she said, for people to invent stories when the truth is uncertain. Yet such stories often tell one something about the tellers. The vicar chuckled, then grew serious. You've heard about Mr. Rowan? Pottle says he made a telephone call just after arriving. Quite insistent he wasn't to be disturbed. Indeed. Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her mind filed this alongside the soil-stained cuff and the narrow case. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Archer appeared with a plate of seed cake and a troubled look. You'll take a slice, Jane, she insisted. And be careful at Harrington House. There's something uneasy there. I felt it even when we went for the harvest supper last month. As if the rooms were waiting. Miss Marple smiled, taking the cake with thanks. Outside, she walked slowly across the churchyard, the gravestones casting short shadows in the late morning light. From here she could see the upper windows of Harrington House glinting against the sky, serene and secretive. She stood for a moment among the lichen-covered stones, letting the breeze ruffle her hat brim. The village was full of whispers, some wild, some wise, some plainly frightened. Out of such fragments, she knew, a whole truth might be assembled, if one only listened carefully enough. Chapter 12. Traces of Mr. Rowan. Inspector Graves arrived at the Dog and Duck just after luncheon, when the inn's common room lay empty save for the scent of baked bread and a lazy fire. Mr. Pottle was polishing tankards behind the counter, humming tunelessly. Afternoon, Pottle, Graves said, producing a mild smile. Thought I'd take a look at your guest book. Just routine. The landlord, glad of an official errand, obliged at once. The signature, Rowan, C., was neat, almost schoolmasterly. Address, care of Westbrook Shipping, London. Graves noted the date of arrival. the same evening Henry Durrant died. Quiet sort he is, Pottle offered. Keeps himself to himself. Though, and here he lowered his voice, I've seen him out early walking towards the old mill track. Carries that slim case with him. Graves thanked him, left a coin for coffee, and stepped outside. The sky was low with pale clouds, the air damp with a promise of rain. Across the green he spied Miss Marple, seated on the bench near the war memorial, apparently engrossed in her knitting. "Good afternoon, Inspector," she said as he approached. Her needles clicked lightly, but her eyes were sharp. "I suppose you've been learning more about our visitor." Graves seated himself beside her. "Rowan claims to work for a shipping firm, but I've telegraphed London and no such name appears on their rolls." He paused, watching the wool slide from her needles. "You've noticed something yourself, haven't you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only that he wears a coat too heavy for the season, and his boots have London dust on the uppers, country mud on the soles. A man who travels quickly between places, or wishes us to think so." They sat companionably while the village went about its quiet bustle. At length Graves rose. "I'll see if our Mr. Rowan is in," he said. "Best to ask a few plain questions." Miss Marple watched him cross to the inn, then gathered her knitting and made for the churchyard path. She preferred not to crowd an interview. Besides, a little visit to the mill lane might prove instructive. Inside, Graves found Rowan seated at a corner table, a map spread before him. The stranger looked up calmly, though his fingers tightened minutely on the edge of the paper. "Mr. Rowan," the inspector began, "may I trouble you for a few particulars about your business in Rosehill?" Rowan gestured to a chair. "Of course, Inspector." His voice was low, pleasantly even. "I represent an estate in Surrey. Executor duties. I'm to collect certain papers Mr. Durrant was holding." Graves kept his face neutral. "You didn't mention that when you registered." "I thought it unnecessary until I'd found them." Rowan folded the map with care. "I understand from the landlord that the police are already in possession of some fragments." The inspector merely inclined his head. Rowan's gaze held steady, but a flicker, wary, calculating, passed behind his eyes. When Graves stepped out a quarter of an hour later, Miss Marple was waiting under the chestnut tree. She tucked away her knitting. "Well," she asked. "He's plausible," Graves admitted, "but I'd stake a week's pay he's hiding more than executor's errands." Miss Marple regarded the inn's small windows, their curtains stirring faintly in the breeze. "Secrets are like smoke, Inspector," she said. "They cling, no matter how carefully one tries to brush them away." Together they turned toward Harrington House, its stone chimneys stark against the silver-gray sky. Chapter 13. A Quiet Tally. By the time Miss Marple reached Harrington House, a faint drizzle had begun to silver the lawns. She shook the drops gently from her hat as she stepped through the carved oak doorway. Inside, the hall smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and the ticking of a long-case clock marked the steady passing of moments. Inspector Graves had gone to speak with the gardener, leaving Miss Marple free to conduct what she described, with a modest smile, as a little taking stock. Mrs. Linton, after a wary glance, consented to show her through the public rooms. They began in the library, where rows of soberly bound books lined the shelves and a faint scent of tobacco hung in the air. Miss Marple let her fingers drift over the spines, pausing at a space where dust lay differently, as though a volume had been recently removed. On the writing desk, a single brass paperweight pinned down a sheet of blotting paper. She held it up to the light. A ghostly impression showed parts of a sentence. Papers. Friday must not. She tucked the thought away. In the morning room, sunlight filtered dimly through muslin curtains. A small table stood near the window, its drawer half open. Inside lay a crumpled handkerchief with faint brownish marks along the edge, as though someone had wiped a sticky substance from their fingers. Miss Marple replaced it carefully, noting how Mrs. Linton watched her every movement. They went on to the upper corridor. The doors here were closed except for one at the far end, a narrow chamber sometimes called, Mrs. Linton explained, the widow's room, for a house legend claimed a grieving lady once shut herself away there. The room was plain, with a single casement looking out over the orchard. Dust lay thick on the sill, except for a small, neat patch where something rectangular had rested until recently. Miss Marple bent and examined the floorboards. One plank bore a fresher scratch, as though moved under weight. She tried it with the tip of her parasol, and it yielded slightly, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Empty now, but it had once hidden something of size. Perhaps a box, perhaps a packet of papers. When they returned to the hall, Miss Marple paused before the great hearth. Ash lay in the grate from the morning's fire. Above it, the mantelpiece held a row of framed photographs. She studied them with seeming idleness, yet she noticed a thin smear on the brass frame of one, wax pale and faintly scented, like that which seals letters. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Linton offered tea, her voice steady but her eyes shadowed. Miss Marple accepted, sitting by the window while rain dotted the panes. The house felt different now, not merely a handsome building, but a place that had absorbed secrets into its walls. When Inspector Graves returned, shaking off raindrops, she told him quietly of the empty hiding place in the widow's room and the imprint on the blotting pad. Graves looked grim. "That room may be the key," he said, "but someone's already emptied it." Miss Marple gazed at the rain-darkened orchard, her hands folded in her lap. "Yes," she murmured. "The question is, who and how much time we have before they hide the truth again." Chapter 14. Secrets Beneath the Floor. A pale mist hung about the orchard when Miss Marple and Inspector Graves mounted the stairs the next morning. The house lay hushed. Only a faint clink from the kitchen drifted up the well of the stair. At the end of the corridor, the widow's room waited, its door standing a little ajar. Graves pushed it open carefully. "I locked this myself last evening," he murmured. The chamber looked much as before. Plain plaster walls, a faded rug, an iron bedstead with a folded quilt. But near the casement, faint new prints marred the dust, the oval marks of boot soles. Miss Marple, leaning on her parasol, regarded them with interest. Graves crossed to the corner where the loose board had yielded the day before. He drew a small screwdriver from his pocket and levered it up. The cavity yawned dark and empty, yet not quite as they had left it. Someone had scraped the base with a blade, leaving fresh gouges in the wood. Miss Marple bent, careful not to disturb the surface. "Whoever came," she said quietly, "knew precisely where to look, and they had little time." A faint scent drifted from the space, wax and something sharper, like varnish. Graves sniffed and frowned. Could have been a small chest, taken out in a hurry. He examined the window. The latch showed a smear of moisture, though the morning air was dry. "They didn't come through the door," he said. "Climbed in or out." Miss Marple studied the orchard below, a simple drop for a nimble figure. The grass flattened where feet had landed among fallen pears. Beyond the trees lay the track toward the old mill. They searched the room inch by inch. Behind the bed, Miss Marple's sharp eyes found a narrow shred of ribbon, blue silk fraying at one edge. She held it delicately. From a parcel, or the lining of a case. Graves slipped it into an envelope. "That ties to Rowan," he said, remembering the faint blue lining of the map case the man had carried. Miss Marple said nothing, but her lips tightened. She glanced at the gray morning light pooling on the floorboards. "Someone is tidying away the truth," she murmured, "and doing so very quickly." They sealed the cavity once more and made a note to post a constable at the landing, discreetly. As they left, Miss Marple paused at the threshold. Her eyes rested on the quiet bed, the scoured floor, the pale curtains stirring at the casement. There was a stillness here, but not peace. It felt rather like a breath held between heartbeats, waiting for someone bold enough to draw it out. Chapter 15. Along the mill track. The rain had lifted by afternoon, leaving the air washed clean and faintly sweet with the scent of wet grass. From the doorway of the Dog and Duck Mr. Rowan stepped out, pausing just long enough to glance at the sky. He wore the same tweed coat, collar turned up, and carried his narrow case. Without a backward look, he set off along the lane that wound towards the abandoned mill. Miss Marple, who happened to be passing the church gate with a basket of dahlias, paused to adjust her glove and observe the direction of his stride. Presently she continued her walk, a little slower, a little thoughtful. Rowan's figure grew smaller as he crossed the meadow beyond the village. The track curled beside a sluggish stream, bordered by alder and willow. Overhead, pale sunlight threaded through branches, scattering coins of light on the path. Once or twice Rowan stopped, stooped as though to study something among the reeds, then moved on. From the shelter of a hawthorn hedge, Inspector Graves watched as well. He had chosen a roundabout route to avoid attention, and now stood silent, noting how Rowan scanned the banks with practiced care. At a bend near the mill, Rowan knelt, pushing aside a clump of nettles. He drew from the mud a small object wrapped in oilskin. For a moment he examined it, a square parcel about the size of a book, then slipped it quickly into his case. He rose, brushing dirt from his sleeve, eyes darting towards the track. Graves stepped back into the shadow of a leaning oak. He could hear the faint rush of water through the broken wheel, and the distant chime of the church clock marking 3:30. Rowan set off again, but not in the direction of the village. Instead, he followed the stream deeper into the trees, where the ground sloped towards a thicket of hazel. Miss Marple, approaching the meadow stile, had caught sight of the change. She halted, apparently absorbed by a butterfly on a thistle, while her mind traced possibilities. A hidden package by the mill, a late visitor to the widow's room. The threads were tightening. Rowan disappeared among the hazels. Graves hesitated only a heartbeat before following, keeping low. The sun slid behind a cloud, dimming the wood. A rook cawed harshly from the mill roof. Rowan quickened his pace. So did Graves, careful of twigs underfoot. At last Rowan reached a hollow where an old willow leaned over the stream. He crouched, slipping the parcel between two roots, then covered it neatly with moss and stones. He stood a moment scanning the wood. Satisfied, he turned back along the track, unaware that two pairs of eyes had marked every movement. Graves waited until Rowan's footsteps faded, then straightened and made a quiet signal toward the meadow. Miss Marple, serene as a lady out for an afternoon stroll, nodded almost imperceptibly before turning back to the village path. They would not disturb the hiding place just yet. Sometimes, Miss Marple reflected, the surest way to catch a fish was to let it tug at the line a little longer. Chapter 16. The Willow's Secret. By the time Graves returned to the willow hollow, dusk had begun to creep over the woods. The air smelled of wet bark and the faint tang of river water. Behind him, Miss Marple descended the bank with steady care, one hand lifting her skirt clear of brambles. Not the most comfortable of errands, she remarked lightly, though her eyes were alert. Graves crouched where Rowan had been. The moss still bore the man's neat impressions. He drew aside the covering stones and lifted the small oilskin bundle free. It was surprisingly heavy. They stepped back from the stream into an open patch of grass, where the last of the daylight filtered through. Graves unwrapped the outer layer with care, revealing a stout cardboard box tied with blue silk ribbon. A match, Miss Marple noted, to the fragment they had found in the widow's room. Graves produced a penknife and slit the ribbon. Inside lay a stack of papers bound with string, and on top, a flat tin containing several wax seals. The papers were ledgers, pages dense with figures and initials, some bearing Henry Durrant's signature. Others were receipts for cash payments, each marked with a curious symbol. Half moon, half star. Miss Marple studied them in silence. A record of transactions, she murmured. And the marks. An accounting for someone who preferred not to write names. Tucked at the bottom was a smaller envelope, scorched at one edge. Graves eased it open, frowning as he scanned the contents. A list of names, and beside each, a sum of money. Several names were familiar villagers. One, however, made him pause. Rowan, he read aloud. And a figure rather larger than the rest. Miss Marple looked up at the first faint star in the sky. It would appear Mr. Rowan is not merely an executor, she said. Graves rewrapped the box, careful to leave the moss undisturbed, and they made their way back towards the lane. Behind them the wood settled into evening hush, the stream whispering over its stones. At the stile, Miss Marple paused, resting her hand on the weathered post. You will put the papers safe, of course, she said, but not too safe. There is value in letting certain people believe they remain hidden. Graves regarded her with a half-smile. You do enjoy a quiet net, Miss Marple. One must be patient with fish, she replied serenely. especially clever ones. They crossed the meadow as the last light faded from the fields, a sense of urgency moving beneath their calm words. The clues were no longer scattered fragments. They were forming the outline of a larger, darker story, and the next step, Miss Marple knew, would draw them all closer to whoever had killed Henry Durrant. Chapter 17. Uneasy supper at Harrington House. Harrington House glowed against the darkening sky, its windows throwing long rectangles of amber light across the lawn. Inside, the drawing room smelled of beeswax and peat smoke. A fire had been coaxed to life against the creeping chill. Mrs. Lorimer presided at the sideboard, arranging the evening tray with a determination that barely masked her restlessness. Rowan came in a few minutes later, brushing raindrops from his sleeve. His expression was composed, but a faint sheen of perspiration clung to his temple. Miss Whitby, perched by the hearth with a volume of poetry, looked up quickly. "Back rather late," she observed, striving for lightness. "I lost track of time," Rowan replied, setting his case near the door. "The air after rain is pleasant for a walk." Mrs. Lorimer clucked softly. "I do wish you wouldn't wander alone, Mr. Rowan. People are uneasy enough as it is." At that moment, the housekeeper entered with news that Inspector Graves wished to speak with Mr. Rowan the next morning regarding the estate accounts. Rowan merely nodded, though his fingers tightened on the back of a chair. Miss Marple sat unobtrusively near the far window, knitting as if the household tensions had nothing to do with her. Her needles clicked in steady rhythm, but her gaze, mild behind the spectacles, missed little. She saw the way Rowan's eyes flicked once, just once, toward the locked cupboard beside the sideboard. Supper was laid in the dining room, a simple meal of roast fowl, bread sauce, and early apples baked with spice. Conversation limped through patches of silence, each guest mindful of unspoken matters. Mr. Linton attempted a joke about the weather, but it fell flat. Even the tick of the bracket clock seemed louder than usual. When the servants withdrew, leaving decanters on the table, Rowan poured himself wine with a hand steadier than he felt. "I trust," he said, attempting composure, "that we may soon have an end to these unsettlements." Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. "An end will come, Mr. Rowan," she said softly, "but it is not always the end one anticipates." Her words hung in the hush like a faint draught. Lorimer glanced uneasily from one face to another, while Whitby bent her head as though studying the grain of the table. Outside, a wind had risen, tapping the long windows with a twig from the yew. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked faintly, though no one had passed along the corridor. Supper ended early. Guests drifted away to their rooms, leaving the dining room shadowed and still. Miss Marple lingered last, folding her knitting with neat precision. She watched the hall where Rowan had disappeared, and a small frown crossed her features, not of alarm but of calculation. She knew the night would not be without incident. Chapter 18. Footsteps after midnight. The grandfather clock in Harrington House struck 12, its solemn notes drifting up the staircase and fading into silence. The house lay steeped in darkness, the fire in the drawing room reduced to a bed of faint embers. Only the wind, prowling round the corners, disturbed the stillness. Miss Marple, in her small guest chamber at the end of the east corridor, sat awake with a single candle glowing on the bedside table. Her knitting lay folded, but her eyes were fixed on the narrow strip of light beneath her door. Long experience had taught her that midnight often coaxed out the most guarded of habits. A sound, soft, measured, reached her ears. Footsteps on the boards outside. They paused, resumed, paused again. She rose and, with remarkable quiet for her age, opened the door an inch. The passage was empty, yet the faint scuff of a shoe came from the far landing near the study. Rowan. He moved carefully, a candle shaded by one hand, the other holding a small ring of keys. Miss Marple watched as he unlocked the cupboard beside the study door, the same one his eyes had strayed toward at supper. He drew out a bundle wrapped in faded sacking and laid it on the table. For several minutes he examined papers under the flicker of his candle, turning pages quickly, lips pressed tight. From somewhere below came another creak, the back stairs. Rowan stiffened, head raised like a startled deer. He swept the papers together, thrust them inside the sacking, and slipped toward the window recess. There he stood utterly still, listening. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had retreated into shadow, holding the edge of her door to steady herself. She heard the faint whisper of fabric. Someone else approaching. A figure climbed from the servants' passage, broad-shouldered, moving with deliberate caution. The moonlight from the stairwell glinted on Inspector Graves' watch chain. Rowan melted back into the gloom, his face unreadable in the half-light. For a few heartbeats the hall was frozen. Graves at the top of the steps, Rowan in the recess, Miss Marple behind her door. Then Graves cleared his throat softly. "Late for account work, Mr. Rowan?" Rowan stepped forward with a brittle smile. "I had difficulty sleeping, Inspector. Thought I might put my time to good use." "Indeed." Graves' tone was mild, but his gaze drifted to the sacking on the table. "Perhaps we should discuss that good use over breakfast." Rowan inclined his head, yet his fingers tightened on the bundle before he carefully returned it to the cupboard. He locked the door, slid the keys into his pocket, and walked past the inspector with studied composure. Graves watched him vanish into the west wing. Then he glanced once towards Miss Marple's closed door. She, unseen, nodded to herself. The pattern of the night had confirmed what intuition already whispered. Downstairs, the wind sighed through the chimney, carrying with it a faint scent of wet earth. Somewhere beyond the trees, the river kept its patient course, as steady and secret as the truths still waiting to be brought into daylight. Chapter 19. The Morning Confrontation. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows of Harrington House, gilding dust motes that floated lazily in the warmth. The house felt quieter than usual, as if the events of the previous night had pressed it into an uneasy pause. In the dining room, Inspector Graves sat with a small notebook open before him, reviewing the fragments of evidence: the parcel from the Willow, the burned papers, the blue silk ribbon. Miss Marple entered, serene as ever, carrying her morning tea. She set the cup before Graves and settled into the chair opposite him. "I think it is time," she said quietly, "to see how Mr. Rowan conducts himself when faced with a simple truth, the sort of truth that does not threaten but invites." Graves looked up. "You mean, confront him without accusation, let him betray himself?" "Exactly," she replied. "Men like Mr. Rowan are clever. But cleverness is seldom the same as composure under gentle pressure." They were interrupted by the soft click of the front door opening. Rowan entered, polished, composed, carrying his case with the air of a man who believed he had nothing to hide. His eyes flicked to the two of them and lingered slightly longer on Miss Marple. "Good morning, Mr. Rowan," Graves began, voice calm but firm. "I believe there are a few questions we ought to clarify regarding the papers you handled last evening." Rowan inclined his head. "Of course, Inspector. I expect nothing less." He set his case carefully on the table. Graves spread the documents from the Willow parcel in neat rows. "Your movements last night, especially in the study and the cupboard, have been noted. Perhaps you can help us understand the urgency behind them." Rowan's fingers traced the edge of the case. "I am merely performing my duties as executor," he said evenly. "The papers required sorting. It is hardly sinister." Miss Marple, knitting quietly at the side, lifted her eyes. "Mr. Rowan," she said softly, "it is remarkable how one can claim duties while disturbing what others might consider sacred. Some duties, you see, are dangerous only when combined with human curiosity." Rowan paused, a flicker crossing his expression that lasted barely a heartbeat before his composure returned. "I do not understand," he said, though his voice betrayed the slightest tension. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured, "but you will. And I am fond of seeing a man think his way through a puzzle, especially when the puzzle concerns him more than he suspects." Graves, sensing her approach, pressed gently. "We need to know, why destroy the burned papers? And why hide this parcel by the Willow yesterday?" Rowan's hands tightened imperceptibly on the edge of the case. His eyes darted briefly toward the window, toward the orchard where footprints and moss had betrayed his earlier visit. Then he exhaled, long and measured. "I assure you," he said finally, "nothing here is illegal. Only delicate matters. I am aware of the sensitivities, and I wish to protect the privacy of those involved." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Privacy is a fine thing, Mr. Rowan. Yet it is rarely the same as secrecy. Secrets, unlike privacy, often weigh heavily, and sometimes snap under a gentle nudge. Graves nodded. It seems we have more to discuss. But for now, we will let breakfast cool. Afterwards, I suggest a thorough review of every document, every ledger, and every envelope. Rowan did not reply immediately. He stood silently, the calm veneer masking the faint tremor of unease. Miss Marple returned her gaze to her knitting, serene, yet her mind was alight with understanding. The game was nearing its tipping point, and every movement, every word, would shape how it concluded. Chapter 20. The Gentle Snare. The morning light streamed through the tall windows of the drawing room, catching the fine dust motes like tiny stars suspended in the air. Miss Marple sat near the fire, knitting calmly, while Inspector Graves arranged the documents from the willow parcel across the table. Rowan entered promptly, as he had done every morning since his arrival, his coat tidy, his hands bare of any soil. His eyes flicked briefly to Miss Marple, then rested on Graves with polite composure. "Good morning, Mr. Rowan," Graves began, voice neutral but edged with purpose. "We shall continue our review of the accounts." Rowan inclined his head. "Naturally. I am at your disposal." Miss Marple, still knitting, lifted her gaze. "Mr. Rowan," she said softly, "I wonder if you ever notice how quickly people become comfortable with the things they think they have hidden. A small gesture, a glance, these betray them sooner than they imagine." Rowan's hands, resting lightly on the edge of the table, twitched imperceptibly. Miss Marple did not rush, did not raise her voice. She merely smiled, as if indulging in a small observation about village life. "Take for instance," she continued. "A certain parcel, I understand, was placed beneath a willow yesterday. One would think a man of careful habits would have considered the moss and stones. Yet the world has ways of watching, even in places so quiet." Rowan's eyes flicked toward the window that framed the orchard, then back to Miss Marple. He said nothing, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed attention, and perhaps unease. Graves leaned forward. "Mr. Rowan, these accounts and the associated papers are not merely curiosity. They may indicate dealings that involve several villagers. We need full transparency." Rowan hesitated, as though weighing every word. Finally, he said, "I assure you, Inspector, my actions were guided by discretion and duty. Nothing untoward has occurred." Miss Marple set down her knitting and spoke in a tone both mild and deliberate. "Ah, discretion and duty, Mr. Rowan. Such fine words. Yet one must consider the weight of a secret too carefully guarded. Sometimes, the very effort to conceal is what leads a man into danger. And often, that danger arrives by the most ordinary, unnoticed of means." Rowan swallowed. His hands fidgeted for a fraction of a second. Miss Marple's eyes met his, steady, calm, almost maternal, yet infinitely perceptive. She leaned back, resuming her knitting, letting the silence stretch. The message was clear without need of accusation. Miss Marple's calm intelligence, her unhurried observation, set the stage. She allowed Rowan to sit with the tension, to contemplate the pattern of events that had already circled him. Graves, watching, nodded quietly to himself. He understood the strategy. Sometimes the cleverest way to catch a man was to let him catch himself, to let him feel the invisible net tightening, thread by thread, until even the most careful man must falter. The day stretched on, the papers lying between them like a minefield, and Miss Marple remained serene, knitting steadily. Yet in every measured glance, every casual remark, she was guiding Rowan ever closer to the point where truth could no longer remain hidden.